Ethan Walker had always felt like life owed him more than it gave. Growing up in a modest house on the outskirts of Sacramento, California, he watched other kids with their shiny gadgets and suburban two-story homes, while he wore hand-me-downs and learned early how to stretch a meal for 2 days. When he was 12 years old, his parents died in a tragic car accident, and the only person left to care for him was his grandmother, Margaret Walker, a retired seamstress who lived on a modest Social Security check and a few savings from cleaning homes in her younger years. Margaret never complained. She welcomed Ethan into her small home with its peeling wallpaper and creaky floorboards. She gave him the only bedroom in the house and slept on the couch for the first 2 years until he insisted she take her bed back. She packed his lunches, encouraged his schoolwork, and never missed a parent-teacher meeting, even when her arthritis made it painful to walk. But as Ethan grew older, her quiet kindness began to feel suffocating. In high school, he envied classmates with new shoes, designer backpacks, and families who vacationed during spring break. Margaret, however, could only offer him thrift store jeans and quiet evenings reading in the kitchen while the television played softly in the background. He kept his head down, studied hard, and eventually got accepted into a prestigious business program in San Francisco. It was his ticket out. Margaret cried when he left, packing his bags with food and slipping a few crumpled $20 bills into his coat pocket. "Just in case you need something," she said with a trembling smile. Over the years, Ethan seldom returned home. College gave him a taste of a different world, one of ambition, wealth, and image. He started dating Allison, a marketing executive with a taste for high-end restaurants and sleek apartments. She never said it outright, but the one time she visited Margaret's home, her silence spoke volumes. She clutched her designer bag tightly, avoided sitting on the old floral couch, and declined the homemade lemon pie with a polite but distant smile. When Ethan landed his first real job at a tech startup in downtown San Francisco, his world shifted entirely. The office was full of energy and ambition, and people who talked in terms of venture capital and scalability. His salary, though modest at first, came with stock options and the promise of future success. He moved into a minimalist apartment with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows. He started going to brunches, networking events, and rooftop parties. But every time he went home, to that little house with the rusted gate and the smell of lavender and old books, he felt a creeping shame. It was no longer comfort. It was a reminder of what he'd left behind, of what he didn't want to be associated with. And so, the resentment grew quietly, like a slow leak in a pipe. One evening, shortly after a dinner party with his co-workers where someone made a joke about still living with your grandma, Ethan came home with a decision already made. He found Margaret in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, wearing her faded apron and humming an old tune. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. Margaret turned to him with a warm smile. "Of course, dear. Is everything all right?" He didn't sit. "I think it's time you found another place to stay, somewhere more suited to your needs." Her smile faltered, but she didn't interrupt. "I just can't keep living like this," he continued. "This isn't how I want to build my life. I'm starting to move up, and this house, this whole situation, it's holding me back." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "I understand," she said softly. "I'll help you pack," he offered, though the words felt hollow even to himself. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. The next morning, she had a small suitcase packed and her coat buttoned up. Ethan had arranged for a cab to take her to a shelter temporarily, under the pretense that she would look for senior housing. As she stepped onto the porch, she paused. Ethan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, heart thudding but face emotionless. She looked at him with an expression that was not angry, not even disappointed, just deeply, indescribably sad. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," she said. And then she was gone. The house felt bigger without her, quieter, cleaner, somehow. But when Ethan stood in the kitchen that night, staring at the empty chair she once occupied, he couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been scraped from the walls. Still, he told himself it was necessary. Growth required sacrifice, and Margaret, bless her, would understand that. Eventually, he moved forward. New job titles, new friends, new furniture. The past was behind him, or so he thought. Because no matter how high he climbed, something in the silence of that goodbye haunted him. The weight of her absence, the way she didn't even flinch when he asked her to leave, the way she looked back, just once, as if trying to memorize his face before turning away forever. He shook it off. He had a future to build. But the past had left a key under the door, and one day, it would let itself back in. The years that followed were everything Ethan had envisioned and more, at least on the surface. His career at the tech startup took off faster than he expected. He worked long hours, often staying at the office past midnight, subsisting on cold brew and catered sushi. His name began to circulate among executives, and within 3 years, he climbed from junior analyst to director of strategic growth. He traded his modest apartment for a luxury high-rise with automated lighting, panoramic views of the Bay Area, and floors so polished they reflected back the image of a man he no longer fully recognized. With the promotion came a new car, a sleek silver coupe with leather seats, and a dashboard that greeted him by name. He posted pictures of his travels to Greece, Japan, and the south of France, each carefully framed to capture not just the landscape, but the lifestyle. His followers envied him. His colleagues admired him. His girlfriend, Allison, beamed beside him at every gala and tech conference, her laughter always loudest when others were watching. But somewhere amid the accolades and achievements, a slow, gnawing void began to take shape inside him. It wasn't dramatic or even noticeable at first, just a quiet sense that, despite everything he'd gained, something essential was missing. He would come home to his luxury apartment, kick off his shoes, and stare out the window with a drink in hand, wondering why the city lights no longer excited him the way they used to. Conversations felt scripted, predictable. Even Allison's voice, once intoxicating, started to sound rehearsed, her affection tied to headlines and bank statements. They argued more often, about trivial things, whether the vacation in Bali or the Maldives, whether the new wine rack matched the modern decor, whether Ethan's phone was always just a little too important. And though he tried to shake the feeling, there were nights when Allison's smile seemed to falter when she thought he wasn't looking, as if she, too, sensed a hollowness beneath the gloss. Occasionally, Ethan thought of Margaret. Those moments always came at strange times, while waiting for an elevator, folding a designer sweater, or walking past someone at the farmer's market who smelled faintly of lavender. He once picked up his phone and tried to call the old number, but it was disconnected. He searched for her on social media, but Margaret had never been one for technology. Her name yielded no results, just silence. He tried not to dwell on it. He told himself she had moved on, probably found some quiet place in a senior home where she knitted and watched soap operas and maybe forgot all about him. That's what he wanted to believe, that her life was peaceful, that she didn't carry the sting of his rejection like a wound that never healed. But sometimes when the parties ended and the guests left and the silence returned, he remembered the look in her eyes that night she left, that small, quiet sadness, the kind that didn't shout but stayed. One evening, after a particularly draining meeting with investors who criticized a pitch he had worked on for months, Ethan came home to an empty apartment. Allison was on a business trip in New York, and he hadn't seen her in 4 days. The space felt sterile. Clean, yes, but also cold. Lifeless. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat on the couch, and flipped through the channels without really watching anything. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, a notification from his bank. At first, he thought it was a routine alert, maybe a low balance warning on one of his travel cards. But when he opened it, his brows furrowed. It was a fraud warning. Unusual activity detected. Please confirm co-owner identity. Co-owner? He read the message again. He logged into his account immediately, and his heart rate picked up. There, listed clearly under account details, was a name he hadn't seen in years. Margaret Walker. His hands turned clammy. For a few moments, he just stared at the screen, stunned. Had it been a mistake? Some kind of glitch? But no. The account in question was one of his primary savings accounts, the one he rarely used but never closed. It had been open when he was in high school, originally under Margaret's supervision, back when she helped him manage birthday money and school expenses. He had completely forgotten that the account had once been joint. He clicked through the transaction history, expecting maybe a dormant account with a few old deposits. Instead, he saw something that didn't make sense. A recent deposit, large, deliberate, and marked with her name. $50,000, transferred just 2 weeks ago. His chest tightened. It wasn't just the amount, it was the implication. Margaret, his grandmother, whom he hadn't seen or spoken to in years, had somehow come into a substantial amount of money, and instead of keeping it for herself, she had deposited it into a joint account he didn't even remember existing. Ethan stood up, suddenly unable to sit still. He paced the room, phone in hand, questions unraveling in his mind faster than he could answer them. Where had she gotten the money? Why would she give it to him? Did she even know he would see it? The next morning, still reeling, he called the bank. After a long series of verifications and holds, he was transferred to the branch manager. The man confirmed that the account was indeed joint and that Margaret Walker had full access. She was listed as a primary when the account was opened years ago. The manager explained. She came in recently to make a deposit. It was unusual, but everything checked out. Ethan leaned forward at his desk. Did she say anything? Did she leave a note? Anything at all? The manager hesitated. Not officially, but she did ask if you still use the account. Said she hoped you'd notice it. Ethan hung up the phone and sank into his chair, mind spinning. He looked around his office, the glass walls, the awards, the framed photo of him and Allison at a product launch, and felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. None of it made sense. And yet, somehow, it made all the sense in the world. He pulled open a drawer, rummaging through old folders until he found a thin, yellowed envelope buried beneath some outdated tax forms. He recognized the handwriting immediately, slightly shaky, but unmistakably Margaret's. It had been there for years, untouched, unopened. On the front, it simply said, "For when you remember what matters." Ethan sat frozen for several moments, the envelope trembling in his hands. He wasn't sure he wanted to know what was inside. The envelope rested in Ethan's hands for a long time before he had the courage to open it. He sat at his desk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room, its light barely touching the corners of his conscience where this envelope now glowed like a flare. He ran his fingers over familiar handwriting, traced the curves of each letter, like someone deciphering a forgotten language. He had no memory of when it was placed there, nor why he hadn't noticed it before. Maybe he had. Maybe he'd simply buried it in the noise of ambition, assumed it was another piece of nostalgia he had no time for. But now, in the silence of a world he no longer fully trusted, it demanded his attention. He slid a letter opener through the paper and unfolded the single sheet inside. It was handwritten. The ink faded slightly, but the voice was undeniably hers. "Ethan, if you're reading this, then maybe something you still remembers. I never stopped believing you would. I know this world can harden us, make us forget what matters. You always had dreams too big for our little house, and I never wanted to stand in the way of them. I just wanted you to know that no matter how far you go, there is nothing wrong with where you came from." The rest was simple. No long confessions, no accusations. Just a reminder that she loved him, that she always had and always would. And then, at the bottom, a line that made his breath catch. "I've been saving, little by little. I hope it helps when you need it, not for what you want, but for what you might have forgotten you need." The letter dropped from his fingers. He leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, overwhelmed by a cocktail of guilt and awe. Margaret had been living who knows where, doing who knows what, and she had still managed to save more than most people would ever accumulate in years. Not for herself, but for him, a man who had sent her away without a second thought. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan couldn't focus at work. Meetings came and went. His responses were mechanical. His smile strained. People noticed but said nothing. After all, he was still Ethan Walker, rising star, the man who always had a solution. But inside, a different narrative was unfolding, one not driven by metrics or performance, but by questions he could no longer ignore. He started digging, not just into the bank records, but into the remnants of a past he had tried so hard to erase. He went through old boxes in storage, found photos from high school, birthday cards Margaret had written in her careful script, receipts for groceries from years ago. each dated and categorized with obsessive care. One box held notebooks with job listings circled in red. Notes like, apply after Ethan's school drop-off, or skip dinner, extra hour at work. She had sacrificed more than he ever understood. He reached out to a few old neighbors from back home using Facebook and outdated email addresses. Some didn't respond. One woman, Mrs. Fernandez, replied a few days later. Her message was brief but impactful. Your grandmother was one of the kindest people I ever knew. She helped everyone, even when she had nothing. I think about her often. He replied instantly, asking if she knew where Margaret had gone, if she'd seen her recently. The response came the next morning. I believe she moved south, maybe Fresno or further. She said she had some friends there. She never said much, only that she hoped you were doing well. It wasn't much, but it was something. By that point, Ethan had grown restless. His days felt disjointed. He found himself leaving the office early, wandering the streets, watching strangers with their families, and wondering how many of them had made the same mistakes he had, how many had traded love for pride. One night, he returned home to find Allison packing. Her designer suitcase was open on the bed. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply said, "You're not here anymore, Ethan. You haven't been here for a long time." He didn't ask her to stay. After she left, the silence was louder than ever. He poured a drink, stared out at the cityscape, and made a decision. The next morning, he took time off work, something he hadn't done in years. He rented a car, not his usual luxury model, but something simpler. He packed lightly, just essentials. And the envelope, always the envelope. He drove south, following the thin trail of information, stopping at libraries, community centers, churches. In each place, he showed a photo of Margaret, taken years ago, but her features timeless in their gentleness. Most people didn't recognize her. Some shrugged politely. Others offered apologies. But then, in a small community center just outside of Modesto, a woman paused when she saw the picture. "She looks familiar," the woman said, frowning thoughtfully. "I think she used to come here, help with meals sometimes. Always wore a blue scarf. Quiet lady, but sweet. Called everyone darling." She smiled. "She left a while back, though. I think she moved further inland." Ethan's heart raced. He asked if the woman had any idea where exactly. She shook her head but pointed to a bulletin board on the wall. She left a note once. Said if someone came looking to check that board. The board was cluttered. Flyers for lost pets, local events, handwritten announcements. And then he saw it. A small envelope, tacked in the corner, labeled with his name in the same careful handwriting. His hands trembled as he removed it. Inside was a folded note. "If you've come this far, I knew you would. I'm proud of you already. I'm living in Fairview now, not far from the orchard. Ask anyone at St. Miriam's. They'll know. And Ethan, you don't have to say anything. Just come sit with me a while. No dramatic closure. No demands. Just an address. And an invitation." Ethan stood there for a long moment, overwhelmed. Around him, the center hummed with life. Children laughing, volunteers chatting, someone playing the piano softly in the next room. But inside him, something had gone very still. He had found what he didn't know he'd been looking for. And now, he was ready to see her again. The drive to Fairview was long and quiet, stretching to the interior of California, where the land flattened into orchards and golden hills, far removed from the sleek towers and polished glass of San Francisco. Ethan kept the windows rolled down, letting the warm wind move through the car as if it could carry away some of the weight pressing on his chest. His mind ran through scenarios, memories, regrets that surfaced now with an almost physical force. He didn't know what he would say. He didn't know if she would even let him speak. All he had was the name of a church, a vague address, and a hope he wasn't too late. Fairview was smaller than he imagined, a town caught between time and geography. The main street had a diner, a post office, and a few stores that looked like they hadn't changed in decades. The people moved slower here, spoke to each other in ways that felt personal. As Ethan parked and stepped out onto cracked pavement in front of St. Miriam's Church, he felt like a man arriving from another planet. His polished shoes crunched over gravel as he approached the modest building, its white paint peeling slightly in the sun. A wooden cross leaned at a slight angle above the front doors, and a community bulletin board flanked the entrance, covered in handwritten notes and fading photos. Inside, the air was cooler. It smelled of old wood, wax, and lavender, a scent that struck him immediately, triggering a memory so visceral he had to pause at the doorway. A middle-aged woman, in a green cardigan, was arranging hymnals near the pews. She looked up as he entered and smiled with easy warmth. "Good afternoon. Can I help you with something?" He hesitated, then stepped forward, his voice uncertain. "I'm looking for someone. Her name is Margaret Walker. I was told she might be connected to this church." The woman's smile faltered just slightly, then returned. "You must be Ethan." He froze. "She mentioned me?" "She did. Left a letter with us a few months ago, just in case. Said you might come looking." The woman walked to a small office just off the main sanctuary and returned a moment later with a sealed envelope. "Here. She asked that we give this to you personally if you ever walk through those doors." Ethan stared at the envelope. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he asked, "Is she still here? In town?" "She lives just a few blocks from here, at the Fairview Community Home. Small place, but good people. She volunteers sometimes when her health allows. Reads to the other residents. Sits with the ones who don't get visitors." The woman paused, eyes softening. "She never said anything bad about you. Not once." That last sentence struck deeper than any reprimand could have. Ethan took the envelope, thanked her, and walked back into the sunlight. He didn't open the letter. Not yet. The church had already given him the answer he needed most. She was still here, still reachable, still waiting, maybe. The Fairview Community Home was tucked behind a row of olive trees, its entrance shaded by a wooden awning covered in flowering vines. It wasn't large, maybe a dozen rooms in total, but it felt like a place built with care. Ethan checked in at the front desk, explained who he was, and waited as a receptionist made a phone call. After a moment, she nodded and gestured toward the garden at the back. "She's outside. It's her favorite spot this time of day." Ethan walked slowly through the hallway, passing residents playing cards, watching television, napping in worn armchairs. The walls were decorated with community art and framed photographs of long-ago celebrations. There was no luxury here, but it felt honest in a way that rattled him. Outside, the garden opened into a small courtyard surrounded by low hedges and rows of wildflowers. A few residents sat on benches, chatting quietly. And there, beneath a tree in a patch of filtered sunlight, sat Margaret. She wore a straw hat, tilted slightly to the side, and a cardigan the color of faded denim. Her hands rested on her lap, still and weathered. She was thinner than he remembered, her frame more fragile, but the way she sat, straight-backed, attentive, was unmistakably her. She was looking down at something in her lap, a book maybe, until she felt his shadow fall across her. She looked up, her eyes met his, and for a moment neither of them moved. The sunlight made her irises look almost golden. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She just looked at him the way she always had, as if he were still the boy who used to chase fireflies in her backyard. Ethan swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "Hi, Grandma." A long pause. Then she nodded slowly. "Hello, Ethan." He dropped to his knees in front of her, overwhelmed by the suddenness of emotion. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For everything I said. For how I treated you. For thinking you were a burden when you were the only person who ever stayed." She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his cheek. "You were hurting, and young, and afraid of the world. I knew that. I never blamed you for trying to find a better life. I only wish you hadn't thought you had to erase me to do it." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "You didn't deserve what I did. And still, you saved for me. You looked after me, even after I pushed you away. I never stopped being your grandmother," she said simply, "even when you stopped being my boy." They sat there for a long time, the silence between them no longer filled with distance but with understanding. She invited him to sit beside her, and he did, folding his hands in his lap like he used to as a child when she read to him. She didn't ask about his work, his money, or his failures. Instead, she spoke about the garden, about the other residents, about the joy she found in small things. Sunlight on tomatoes, the sound of birds at dawn, the pleasure of quiet days. Ethan listened, and for the first time in years, he felt peace settle into his bones. When it came time to leave, she didn't ask him when he would return. She only said, "You know where I am now. That's enough for today." He nodded, promising himself it wouldn't be just a day. Back at his car, he finally opened the letter she had left at the church. It was short, just a single paragraph. "If you're reading this, then we've found each other again. That's all I ever wanted. Keep walking forward, Ethan. But take me with you this time. Not in your guilt, but in your kindness." As he drove away, the orchards blurred past his window, and the city seemed like a distant thing that had little claim on him anymore. He had come looking for answers. What he found was far greater. He had found the truth, and a second chance. Ethan returned to Fairview 2 days later, this time without hesitation. He left his hotel before sunrise and arrived at the community home just as the groundskeeper was unlocking the front gate. The morning air was brisk, tinged with the scent of earth and dew, and the sky was painted in soft hues of lavender and pale blue. He carried with him a paper bag from the local bakery, fresh bread, apricot jam, and 2 cups of coffee, just as he remembered Margaret liking it. She was already awake, seated beneath the same tree in the garden, as if waiting for him. Her hands were wrapped around a ceramic mug of tea, her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders. When she saw him approaching, she smiled, not broadly, not theatrically, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had known, somehow, that he would come back. "I thought I might see you again," she said, accepting the bag with a nod of appreciation. "I brought breakfast," he replied, setting everything down on the bench beside her. "It's not much, but it's local. I thought you'd appreciate that." "I appreciate you being here more than anything, that bag," she said, and her words landed like sunlight on his chest, warm, unforced, and deeply real. They ate in silence for a while, the rhythm of the morning unfolding around them. Birds calling to one another from the branches above, distant laughter from inside the home, the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. Ethan felt the knot in his chest slowly begin to loosen. He didn't try to fill the air with explanations or updates about his life. There would be time for that later, if she wanted to hear it. For now, it was enough just to be present. Over the next few weeks, Ethan returned again and again. Each visit brought a new layer to their reunion. A deeper sense of peace, a greater understanding of what he had truly lost and miraculously found again. He began to learn the rhythms of the community home, the names of the residents, the stories they were eager to share with anyone who would listen. He found himself helping Margaret with her volunteer work, reading aloud to a man who had lost most of his vision, pushing wheelchairs through the garden paths, and cleaning up after afternoon gatherings in the common room. What surprised him most was how natural it felt. There was no sense of penance, no lingering pressure to make up for everything at once. Margaret never once demanded he explain himself, nor did she dwell on the years they had spent apart. She treated him not as a prodigal grandson returning in disgrace, but as a person who had come home in his own time. And in doing so, she gave him space to rediscover who he had once been, before ambition had hollowed him out. One afternoon, they sat beneath the same tree, watching a group of children from a nearby school planting flowers in the garden. The community center had organized a partnership with the local elementary school, and Margaret was helping coordinate the effort. Ethan leaned back on the bench, a smile tugging at his mouth. "I don't think I've ever seen you so active," he said. She chuckled softly. "It's easier when the work matters. These days, I like to keep busy helping people who don't expect anything in return. It keeps me honest." He nodded, looking at the kids laughing and chasing each other around the flower beds. "You saved that money for me," he said after a long pause. "All those years, you gave up so much." Margaret turned to him, her gaze steady. "That money was never about wealth, Ethan. It was about choice. I wanted you to have a choice, even if you didn't realize you needed one. I hoped one day you'd use it for something good, not just for you, but for others." Her words settled into him, not like a lecture, but like a seed planted in soft soil. Later that evening, back in his hotel room, Ethan opened his laptop and began to type. He drafted a message to the board of directors at his company, explaining that he would be stepping back temporarily. He needed time, not just a rest, but to reconnect with a part of his life that had been neglected far too long. The message was met with surprise, some confusion, and a few polite attempts to dissuade him, but he stood firm. In the weeks that followed, he rented a small place on the outskirts of Fairview. Nothing extravagant, just a one-bedroom cottage with a modest porch and a garden that needed tending. He began splitting his time between occasional consulting work and volunteer projects at the community center. He offered financial planning workshops for low-income families, using the skills he'd once reserved for high-stakes investors to help people navigate real-world challenges. Slowly, the cold, calculated edge of his former life gave way to something warmer, something rooted. Margaret watched him closely, never interfering, but always present. She would sometimes join his sessions, sitting quietly in the back, knitting or taking notes. When he asked her once why she bothered, she said, "I like knowing I'm still learning from you, even now." They spent weekends cooking together, simple meals with fresh ingredients from the local market. They walked through the orchards, picked berries, and reminisced without bitterness. Ethan learned about the years she had spent cleaning houses after he left, the friends she had made in Fairview, the nights she sat by the window wondering if he was safe. She never blamed him. She simply missed him. Months passed, and the rhythm of their life settled into something neither of them could have imagined back when their relationship fractured. Fairview became more than a place. It became a home, not in the grand sense of real estate or wealth, but in the quiet, intimate way that home lives in memory, in routine, in forgiveness. One day, as summer faded into fall, Ethan accompanied Margaret to a town hall meeting where community leaders were discussing the lack of resources for elderly care. He listened as voices filled the room, some angry, some desperate, all seeking solutions. After the meeting, he turned to Margaret with an idea. "I want to use the money," he said. "Not for me, for this town, for people like you. A fund for seniors, for housing, for care that doesn't make people feel forgotten." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, then reached for his hand. Now you know what it was really for. The account that bore her name, and his was never just a bank account. It was a ledger of love, of sacrifice, of belief. And now, it would become a foundation, not just financially, but morally, spiritually, generationally. Ethan had made peace with his past. But more than that, he had begun to build a future worthy of it.